Good morning, everybody. Can everybody hear me? Is it Mr. Bannon? Good, yes, thank you. Thank you. Good morning. It's 9:30 and the examination of the Greater Norwich Local Plan is resuming. Today we shall be dealing with matter 6, which is concerned with homes, principally policy 5 of the plan. And this morning we shall be dealing with issue 1 and issue 2 as set out in the matters, issues and questions. My name is Mike Warden, and along with my colleague Tom Hatfield, we shall be examining. We're inspectors appointed to examine the plan. I shall be leading matters 1 and 2, and Mr. Hatfield will be leading the other matters when we come on to them later. Many of you have been to previous sessions for on the examination, and so I don't need to repeat for you the protocol and process. But just for those who haven't, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand using the hand raise function, and please generally have your video off unless you're speaking. And please make sure that mobile phones, etc., are put to silent when you are not on mute. Can I just, first of all, just ask the partnership to introduce its team for this morning, so we know who we're dealing with, and then when we go through, when we start the session, I will invite everyone when they first speak to state who they are and who they're representing. Thank you. But can I just have an introduction, please, from the partnership as to who will be speaking today?
Morning, sir. My name is Adam Banham. I'm a principal planner working on behalf of the partnership. We've got various colleagues and consultants joining us for various parts of the issues. For issue 1, we've got our viability consultant, Mr. Bisley, and our housing needs expert from Opinion Research Services, Nigel Moore, and I'll be joined by Mr. Morris, who you're familiar with, and Mr. Bird as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Banham. Thank you. Right, thank you. So if we turn to issue 1 and we look at the policy 5, sorry, on homes, and we're dealing with the first section of that policy, which is concerned with affordable housing. But first of all, we've set out in our MIQs a number of questions, 11 questions that relate to issue 1. Some of them overlap. Some of them will just flow into the next questions, so they will be used as a guide for this discussion. But we may stray into a separate question naturally because of the nature of the subject. Can I just start, please, with trying to understand what the affordable housing position is? The LHNA paragraph 51 states that the need is 10,007, but then table 51 seems to suggest it is 10,360. In the topic paper, the SMA, it states that the SHMA states that over 11,000 affordable homes are required. I know there's various adjustments, etc., but can we get some clarity, please, on what is the affordable housing need for the planned period, please?
I may invite colleagues, Mr. Morris and Mr. Moore, to add to this, but essentially our evidence has found that the affordable housing needs per annum is 670, which was based on the latest work by Opinion Research Services, and that equates to 34% of the overall need. I may just refer to Mr. Moore to give some further insight on the RS work.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I'm Nigel Moore, Head of Housing Assessments at Opinion Research Services. So we conducted the local housing needs assessment. The process we go through for conducting these assessments is to consider what would happen if trends continued within Greater Norwich. So how much affordable housing need would be required under those circumstances, but then also to make this consistent with the local housing needs figure set out by the standard method. So we begin with household projections, but once we've completed the household projections and looked at how many people require affordable housing, but how many people need housing but are unable to afford market housing, we look at that as a first instance, and then people who potentially aspire to home ownership despite being able to afford the private rents they can't afford to own. So we then add that group to the list. We then consider additional households who are brought in by the local housing needs figure, the standard method figure, who are above the trend growth. And then we add, finally, a vacancy rate to this figure. So we add a vacancy and second home figure. So when you're looking at a range of different affordable housing needs across the area, then what we're really looking at is the consequences of different ways of looking at the same issue, which is basically adding and adding and adding as we go along until we eventually get to the final answer, which has been set out by the council.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. So what is the total figure for the planned period of affordable homes that are required, for which the policy would be seeking to meet?
It would be the 670 per annum. I'd have to quickly calculate that, and we can provide that total figure to you, sir.
So that's simply 670 times the numbers of years in the plan.
Yeah, that's correct.
And how does that relate to table 51 of the LHNA?
So table 51 is our principal evidence on that. That's where we get to our figure of 518 per annum. Then we've added in the 152, which comes from right to buy sales.
Okay, so the 670 is comprised of the 518 from that table plus 152 right to buy.
That's correct. And if my maths is correct, that equals 13,400 over a 20-year period.
That's correct.
So that 13,400 is if the policies are successful, I suppose that is what the policy should provide to meet affordable housing need.
That's correct. If every site provided in accordance with policy, then that would be the case. But obviously, we appreciate there will be exceptions there, small sites and so forth.
Okay, thank you. There's some hands up. Mr. Brent had his hand up, I think. Yes, Mr. Brent.
Thank you, sir. Mark Berrant from the Home Builders Federation. It was just really a query through you, sir, to the council and the consultants there, with regard to the approach taken with regard to right to buy sales, and whether obviously the assessment made by ORS and Mr. Moore suggests that it's a trend-based approach. So that trend-based approach will have taken into account the high level, the level of right to buy sales in previous years, which would then have contributed to the level of need moving forward. So in terms of, is there a sense of potentially a sense of double counting in terms of having a trend-based approach that will have taken into account the level of right to buy sales in the past, and obviously moving forward with regard to that. So it feels, sir, that there is potentially double counting in terms of actually how that's been approached, and to sort of reach that need, but then add on those right to buy sales doesn't seem to be particularly consistent with what the approach that's been taken in terms of a trend-based approach, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Brent. Mr. Moore, are you able to answer that point?
Yes, when we explain that we are undertaking a trend-based approach, we're looking at this from the demand side of the point of view, not from the supply point of view. So we're looking at the trend growth in need through household growth and affordability and who needs affordable housing. We are not factoring in any changes on the supply side at that point. So our model is a net change in the demand for affordable housing. And for every one affordable housing that you sell under right to buy, you would need to replace it, because effectively it's it's a reduction of one every time you sell one in your stock, and you need to replace that within our model on a one-for-one basis. So it's definitely not been double counted. I think is the key to this. We're looking at who needs affordable housing going forward, and what's the net requirement for affordable housing. And then if the council were to lose stock in any direction through demolitions, through right to buy, that needs to be added. Equally, if they made purchases of private sector stock to add to the supply, then that would actually be counting towards meeting the need. And none of that is treated within the trend-based model as anything other than just a net change.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. Mr. Brent, do you want to come back on that?
Certainly, sir. In that case, I suppose it's I accept Mr. Moore's position in terms of that they're looking at base lead and not looking at supply in the past, and you're then equating then that supply and adding that supply in terms of what's needed. It's not necessarily that you've still got what is needed, and that's what move forward. Just because you remove supply doesn't necessarily mean that if that supply had been removed, say through right to buy, that supply would have been part of what could have been contributed to what to meeting needs. So I think there is in essence a double counting in terms of looking at that position. What the council set out in their 10-360, which was the base lead, is what is needed, and the number of homes that provide will meet that need. Because a house comes out of supply doesn't mean that you still need a house to provide that. It doesn't mean that it has to be from that house. So I think there is a certain element of putting a supply side element into what is the housing need in terms of what is, from Mr. Moore said, a population-based figure. So it doesn't seem to marry up in terms of actually what the approach is taking in terms of looking at needs going forward in terms of population, and then adding into that supply side. I can understand the desire to replace that house, but it doesn't mean just because someone has bought that house that it necessarily adds to the demand, to the need for it. That's a supply side function which would be addressed through addressing the needs that are there within the area. So it just doesn't seem to be. It seems to be bolting on a supply side element to what is, as Mr. Moore said, a demand side assessment of need.
So if I understand this, Mr. Brent, put it in simple terms, and suppose if someone manages to buy a house, then that doesn't mean that there is an affordable need for that house that has been bought, because that person has taken themselves out of affordable need. Is that correct?
Exactly, sir. They've taken themselves out, so it doesn't add to the need. It means there's one less home in that supply, but it doesn't add to the need as far as I would understand in terms of that. But Mr. Moore may be able to correct me on that. Sorry, sir. Thanks.
Yeah, Mr. I'm aware that there's one participant wants to make a point, but if Mr. Moore, would you just be able to respond to that, and then I'll invite the participant in, which I think is from Halsbury.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the point that I'm trying to make, has actually just been made, which is it doesn't add to the need. The need is a trend-based model, and we look at the household growth, but there's one less supply to meet that need. And therefore you're replacing the lost supply when you sell a right to buy within our model. So we're looking at a net need for affordable housing. If you sell a property under right to buy, that household may be lifting itself out of the current need for affordable housing, but there's also one less unit available to meet future supply. So we're comparing the demand over the long run, the need over the long run for affordable housing with the available stock. And for every unit you sell, you've got one less unit of stock available to meet that need in the long run. So you'll have to replace that within the model.
But if you're meeting that need,
yes,
then would there be an affordable household wanting to come into that additional property, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, if someone has bought under right to buy, they've been able to obtain a mortgage or have had money from somewhere else, and therefore would no longer be in affordable housing need anyway, because they've been able to afford to buy under right to buy. They've been able to buy that property out. But we're not looking at the needs of existing households in existing dwellings who are suitably housed. We're worried about the future households who are going to be coming forward, who need a supply in the future, and that property is no longer available to them. Or we're worried about the two basic groups that we worry about: the current households in need, those ones who require people who are not suitably housed within the affordable housing sector and require an affordable home, and those coming forward in the future who need affordable housing. And if a property has been sold under right to buy, then that property is not available in the future for them to live in, and therefore that needs to be replaced one for one within our model, because our model is a net balance of the need for affordable housing against the supply of affordable housing. So for every one you sell, you have to replace it with another.
But those coming forward in the future for affordable housing need within the planned period, would they not be within the 10,360?
Sorry, I missed that question. Sorry,
those coming forward, as you said, for need in the future,
yeah,
to fill that, looking for that property that would have gone through right to buy, would they not be within the 10,360 anyway?
Yes, they would be within. Yes, they would be within the need. But the supply, which would be meeting their need, is not going to be available in the future, because that property is not going to re-enter the supply. The way in which affordable housing works, obviously, is you get your tenancy, and at the end of your tenancy, when either you move out or you have the death of the final occupant in that property, it comes back into the more general supply and someone else can occupy it. If it's been bought under right to buy, that property is no longer available. So you've lost one unit of supply to meet the overall need for affordable housing. And that's why we're counting it, as I say, it keeps coming back to, this is a net need, the 10,300. And therefore you need more dwellings as a gross need to replace the ones which are being lost. So the gross delivery needs to be the 670 per annum to include both the net additional households who are going to require affordable housing, plus the replacement of the stock which is being sold under right to buy.
Thank you. I'll invite, in fact, I think it's Halsbury who wanted to come in. There was a hand up, and it's going up as Philip Jeans, which I think might be Halsbury from what the experience of the previous session. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Want to come in?
Can you see us, sir? Can you see us and hear us?
I can now, yes, thank you.
Yes, good morning, sir. It's Satnam Chung of Council. Yes, in these Halsbury homes, we apologise, we've been unable to reset the settings so that you can see Halsbury homes as opposed to Mr. Jean's. I've got, according to your list, I think it was James Stacey, but I've actually got Jamie Roberts, Mr. Roberts here, to speak about affordable housing. I think he had a point of clarification, but it may be that the point's already been picked up by Mr. Moore.
Yeah, good morning, Jamie Roberts of Tetlow King Planning, looking at the affordable housing issues for Halsbury Homes. Yeah, I think we just echo the comments of Mr. Moore in respect of the right to buy and the kind of one-for-one replacement. Right to buy losses, as you say, it takes stock out of the supply to meet newly arising needs. And I think the only additional point I'd just add is that this is a matter that's been recognised by the Secretary of State and inspectors in appeal decisions. The recent House of Lords Committee report has raised concerns about the impact of right to buy on overall stock. The Affordable Housing Commission in March 2020. So this is a widely acknowledged issue, but right to buy losses are depleting the housing stock and at present are not necessarily being replaced at a rate sufficient to cover those losses. The net result is that the housing supply of affordable housing goes down over time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Roberts. Mr. Burent, did you want to come back on anything that Mr. Moore said here before we just move on to look at requirements?
I think so. I recognise that there is a need to maintain to deliver the stock, and right to buy will diminish that stock. But I suppose it's just how that relates between need and supply, and I don't think that's been clearly set out in terms of the council stating that they need 10,360 homes to meet need going forward, and how that, and then adding a supply element onto it. So I think it's just that juxtaposition between needs and supply, and actually how that should work within the model. Which I think you've heard our comments, sir, and you've heard Mr. Moore's comments, and I'll leave it at that, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Burnt. Thank you. If we can now look at, we've kind of into questions 1 and 2 now, really, and 3, which look at requirements. So what I'd like to understand is about requirement, and I'll invite. I'm particularly interested in the justification for the requirement. We've heard about the level of need and whether that should be adjusted, but can the partnership please then just help us with how the requirement of 33%, except in Norwich City, in Norwich City Centre, where the requirement is at least 28%. Can you just explain how you've arrived at the figure of 33% and why there is a difference in the city centre?
Certainly, sir. The issue at hand really is over being pragmatic over the viability of sites. So we set our requirement at 33% based on the needs evidence that was before us, but in considering viability evidence and consultation we had with the industry, we noted that there were some challenges around city centre sites. So we conducted some further work and took the pragmatic decision to set a 28% requirement in the city centre. It's set out in the topic paper, but obviously we are conscious of the fact that the large proportion of the affordable housing need actually arises in the city, but equally there can be some challenges over bringing affordable housing forward on brownfield sites in the city centre.
What would those percentages apply to the sites? What would that deliver? Would that meet the need that has been identified that we've just discussed?
The need in the city council area is 42% affordable housing. So there is a need there, which we simply want to address, but at the same time we don't want to stifle development in the city centre, hence the dual approach.
And so overall, is the affordable housing need within the plan area met by those percentages, or expected to be met by those percentages?
We believe so. We've set that requirement to meet the need, but as I said, we've also recognised the unique challenges around certain brownfield sites in the city centre.
And what are the implications of that, with a 40% affordable housing need in the city centre, but requirement being less and therefore not being met within the city centre or on one of the large brownfield site potentially? What are the implications of that in terms of meeting housing need within the plan area?
Well, the 28% requirement only applies to the city centre, so that's a smaller geographical area than the boundary of the city council itself, so that there will be scope to meet the overall affordable housing need, whilst recognising where there are viability challenges on certain sites.
So what are the implications of that for those seeking housing need? Then that the city centre requirement is lower than you would expect it to be normally, because you've got a higher than plan area rate requirement, but a lower actual requirement. So you've got a greater need for affordable housing within the city centre, but a lower requirement. So what are the implications of that?
It will inevitably mean a degree of dispersal. So there will be people who have their affordable housing need met elsewhere in the city council and the urban fringe area.
And can you just explain to me how you, just very briefly, how those targets have been arrived at? Because you've explained that the 28% has taken account of viability and constraints within the city centre, but how have those figures, and how has 33% been arrived at?
33% was arrived at by both looking at the needs and testing the viability of development. So we've took a balanced approach to take account of those two competing variables. The requirement in the city centre, the 28%, was informed by our viability work, and our viability work showed that around 26% appeared to be coming out as a typical level of viability, and therefore 28% represented a pragmatic and sensible starting point for negotiation.
Thank you. Are there any points from participants in relation to those percentages, those percentage requirements? Mr. Burdett.
Thank you, sir. This may be a discussion for later questions, but we're here representing 3 house builders and have reviewed the viability reports prepared, and we do have some concerns about the inputs to the viability assessment, which would affect both of these percentages. But like I say, this is probably something for later on, but I just wanted to flag it up now.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Burdett. Mr. Burrant.
Thanks, sir. It was really just in terms of, as you've seen from my statements, we consider the housing need of 10,360 in terms of our statements, and it is just whether there is a, if it is that level, if you did consider that to be the case, then there is potentially a significant over provision in terms of the policies that are set out in policy 5, sir. In terms of recognise that there needs to be flexibility in there, in the same way there is in market housing, but there could be a significant level of oversupply above that flexibility that you see in the market housing, sir. So it was just that was our main concern, but that set out in our statement, sir, and it really reflects on terms of what the affordable housing need you consider it to be, in terms of both the discussion we've just had and what the council are saying in terms of their overall level of needs, sir.
Mr. Van, applied, those percentage requirements were applied, and I know that some sites will deliver at different rates because of viability issues, and but what would be delivered in terms of affordable housing over the planned period? Is there an expectation of what that would bring in, and how would that relate to the need?
We've done some work which is set out in our topic paper, which looks at how the pipeline of affordable housing is growing, and that was a piece of work that was done over the summer, and showed that the pipeline of sites with planning permissions was growing towards that 670 figure per annum. Obviously, the more wider point, I think, stands around our viability evidence, and that showing that the policies as set out in policy 5 are achievable. It's obviously not possible for us to speculate at this stage on the affordable housing that may be provided on a site that hasn't come forward with a planning application at this stage.
Thank you. Can I just move on to question 4? And this, I just want to understand this, because I know that a number of representations have been made in response to this point, which is about the viability assessment at the decision-making stage. Can you just explain to me what is the basis for that requirement that relates just to brownfield sites, and why that doesn't apply to other sites, and whether that is consistent with the provisions of the framework?
We obviously, in writing the policy, we want to be in compliance with the framework. So our approach was to produce evidence that did the work at the plan making stage as is set out by the framework. Through the work we did, we recognised the point that was coming back from consultees in the industry about the challenges of brownfield sites, and we wrote that into the policy. We weren't in any way trying to work against the framework. We were just simply trying to do as the framework requires in terms of doing the viability work at the plan making stage.
Do participants wish to come in at this point? I know this was a matter that number of people have raised issues about. Mr. Brandt.
Sorry, sir, me again. In terms of the council's point, is that the paragraph 58 of the NPPF doesn't make the distinction between the circumstances in terms of brownfield sites or greenfield sites. Indeed, greenfield sites can have unforeseen levels of infrastructure costs that may need to be taken into account. So there are abnormal and unforeseen costs that and changes in the economic circumstances facing those sites. And I think those need to be taken into account when the council are considering in terms of the ability to negotiate on with regard to affordable housing. Clearly, the council are looking to set this as Mr. Banham said earlier, as a starting point with regard to that. Whether that's consistent with the NPPF's approach is an issue. But I think in terms of if you're looking to have a negotiation decision, which the council are clearly looking to do, then paragraph 58 suggests that there is no distinction between brownfield and greenfield sites there, and it should just be an ability for all sites to be able to have a discussion around the viability and the level of affordable housing to be provided.
Thank you, Mr. Brandt. Mr. Hill.
Thank you, sir. I mean, I raised my hand there, but ultimately I think Mr. Brent's just sort of covered all of our points very succinctly. And the only point we'd added is that we believe it's not consistent with the policy. I think by the work with the NPPF, I think the policy almost preempts the decision maker's ability to give consideration to an assessment at the determination of an application. So I think on that basis, we would contest that it's not consistent with the guidance with the NPPF. But other than that, I haven't got anything to add to what's either in our hearing statement or what Mr. Brent said. Thank you,
Mr. Hill. Sorry, I just didn't catch who you represented, Mr. Hill.
Sorry, sir. We represent Able Homes and also Scott Properties, both in relation to the same point.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Durant.
2 acres. Sure. Okay.
Yeah, Ed Durant from Pegasus Group on behalf of Barrett's David Wilson Homes. We took part in the session yesterday where we discussed policy 2, which related to kind of an increase in energy standards and energy saving above the building regulations. And that policy has the ability to submit a viability assessment.
Sorry, Mr. Durant. Ms. Feeney, is it the background noise?
Yes,
there is some background noise, Mr. Durant.
It's coming across on the system, Ed.
Yeah, so I've got a colleague on the phone. 1 second. Sorry about that. Just a colleague on the phone. I've asked him to leave the room now. So as I said, yesterday we attended a session on policy 2, which has the ability to submit a viability assessment where it's demonstrated that the energy requirements of that policy can't be met. And there was obviously a great deal of discussion from members of the Green Party and other interested parties in increasing the level of energy conservation in new dwellings. So I would suggest that there's often a conflict between different aims and objectives of the council, whether they be the delivery of affordable housing, whether they be greater energy standards. And it would be kind of remiss of the council not to allow that balancing exercise to take place at the planning application stage in accordance with paragraph 58, so that all of the material considerations and the aims and objectives of the local plan can be taken into account. And that may well result in a lower percentage of affordable housing where it results in other planning benefits that the council also wants to secure. So they shouldn't remove that ability, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Durant. Mr. Bannon, would you like to respond to those points, please?
Certainly, sir. Yes, I mean, our ultimate aim here is to prepare a policy which is clear for decision makers and in accordance with the framework. So, you know, if you were to consider that there was some need to clarify the policy in some way, then we would give that due consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Bannon. Thank you, Mr. Burdett.
Thank you. So just a quick one. In responses to our representations, the council did state that the viability of large strategic sites may well be considered on an individual basis. So clearly we need a bit of clarity on which way this is going to go.
Well, I mean, I'm testing the soundness of the policy. We don't necessarily need to have clarity today on which way it's going to go. I'm asking some questions to understand what people's concerns are, and looking at its how it relates to the framework, and inviting the council to comment on those and to explain. So Mr. Banham has explained. It will be for us as inspectors to decide on what the policy, how it needs to be altered, if it does need to be altered, in order to make it sound.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Davis.
Yes, thank you very much, sir. It's just an observation that clearly we've got an ongoing trend, as has been demonstrated through the representation from Mr. Moore and so on, in terms of affordable housing. Is it the assumption that that trend will continue? Because clearly the aim surely would be to ensure that we provide housing for the vast majority of people and those who are seeking that affordable housing, that demand will go down over time. And so there are certain priorities here, and as was mentioned by Mr. Durant, in relation to energy efficiency and so on. And that surely a policy, a plan of this kind should identify those priorities to be able to then improve on what we have now. And surely that is the aim, and not to leave it to individual, as has been suggested, planning applications to decide on those priorities. That this plan establishes those priorities, and that there are certain issues such as energy efficiency, reduction of carbon emissions, meeting the demand for affordable housing. Surely those are priorities that need to be emphasised and highlighted. Thank you.
So, Councillor Davis, are you suggesting? Is your suggestion that the issue about viability assessments at the decision-making stage relating only to brownfield land, should that only relate to brownfield land, or should it relate to wider sites?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, it should be to wider sites. So, but I thought I'd mention that there, given that it's been raised. But yes, thank you for that clarification. Thanks.
Thank you, Hannah Leary.
Thank you, sir. I'm Hannah Leary from Barton Wilmore, representing Burlier Limited here, sir. A couple of points and an observation. We, in general, I won't repeat what we said in our previous representations, but as a general point, would support a 28% requirement in relation to sites within the Norwich urban area, not just within Norwich city centre. But at the same time, also support the position as set out in Policy 5 in relation to the ability to submit viability assessments in relation to brownfield sites. just one observation going back to something Mr. Bannon was talking about earlier on, and the points around the fact that the need within the city centre is at about 42%. It seems to me that brownfield sites within the Norwich urban area, which face the same constraints that brownfield sites within the city centre may also face, are effectively therefore being penalised unless sites within that Norwich urban area can demonstrate through the submission of a viability assessment that they can only deliver 28% or less. They're being penalised by being set within the 33% bracket rather than the 28% bracket, which is identified for the city centre. Thank you, sir.
So I don't. Could you just ask what you mean by penalised?
Well, it seems to me that the city centre is effectively being allowed potentially to deliver less affordable housing than is actually required. If there's a 40% need, 42% need within the city centre, the level is being set considerably lower, but therefore higher in the areas outside the city centre, when those areas, particularly within the Norwich urban area, may face very similar constraints, which may impact upon their viability. So the levels seem to be imbalanced to me, sir, in terms of the level that's being required in the city centre as compared to the immediate surroundings within the Norwich urban area.
Thank you. Mr. Banham, are you able to respond to the points that have been made, including that last point about the difference in requirements between the city centre and the outer areas?
Yes, I mean, I suppose I can only really repeat what I said earlier, in that it's a balancing act between the viability considerations, but also the affordable housing need considerations. So we've taken the approach we have for a combination of those two reasons.
Thank you. Can I just move forwards into looking at whether the requirements are deliverable, and there is some concern expressed by some participants that the requirements of 33%, particularly, is not deliverable, given the I suppose the track record of delivering affordable housing in the plan area, and I've just picked up some figures here that, I mean, we're looking at really question 10. We'll come back to some of the other points. It's more of a discussion in the round, really, but in relation to delivery 2011 to 2021, I think it was 25%, and the 2016 to 21 was 26%. So my question is the 33% and 28% target really deliverable, and does the evidence support that that is deliverable?
I mean, essentially, I would turn to our viability evidence here. That did look at 33% modelled on a split of 75 to 25 between affordable rent tenure products and affordable home ownership products. We found in the viability work across the 11 typologies that we applied that 33% was indeed achievable based on assumptions set in the Harman guidance and so forth, with the exception, obviously, of the city centre brownfield typology. So, yes, we acknowledge that past permissions have been given it slightly less than 33%. I think that, though, does show that the the flexibility the partnership exercises in its decision making as well.
Thank you. Do any participants wish to come in on that point about the deliverability of those requirement figures? Mr. Chung.
Yes, it's Mr. Roberts.
Thank you.
Good morning. Yeah, just to pick up on a couple of points that we flag in our representations. So we've got a giant table at figure 4 of our representations, but we've looked at calculating a gross affordable housing completions rate across the entirety of the previous core strategy period back to 2008. When you look at that entire core strategy period, that gives us, I suppose, a gross completions rate of 29%. Now, sir, you've picked up on the 25% observed from, I think, 2011 onwards. And I think that 25% is probably a realistic figure, just because the previous years caught the kind of immediate post-recession period, when there was lots of money being pumped into affordable housing delivery, and we saw quite high rates of completion spend. So I think that 25% affordable delivery is a fair benchmark in terms of the trends that have been observed. I think the second point I'd make is looking ahead into, admittedly, the next 5 years for which the more detailed data is available. But our figure 5 shows that over the next 5 years, affordable will only comprise 22% of total completions. And so what that means is that in the remaining years of the plan period, the council will have to do quite a bit of catching up to do if it's to meet that need in full. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other participants wish to come on this point before I go back to Mr. Banham? Mr. Burdett.
Thank you, sir. The deliverability question, as Mr. Banham has said, is based on the viability, and our concern with the viability is set out in our representations. I don't want to repeat those in detail, but we do have issues with, for instance, the benchmark land value, the revenues, costs, developer profit, and some assumptions regarding densities. Mathematically, based on the council's viability assessment, yes, they can be delivered, but it's those assumptions that inform that assessment that concern us, and therefore about deliverability.
Thank you, Mr. Burdett.
Thank you.
No more hands up, so I will invite Mr. Banham to respond to those points. Mr. Banham, please.
There's not too much more for me to add, except to say, obviously, 33% affordable housing was our policy set in the joint core strategy. The fact that we may be around 29% affordable housing as a sort of gross figure, I think actually underlines the fact that 33% is achievable in the majority of cases, and the councils have demonstrated their track record in listening to the development industry if there are site-specific issues.
Thank you. And what are the implications if those targets are not met? What does that mean?
Well, I think obviously we would, be failing to meet the overall affordable housing needs of the community, and that's probably a point that we would have to address in a future review of the plan.
Mr. Roberts.
Thank you, sir. I suppose our view on that is that the framework is quite clear at paragraph 62 that local plans should reflect the needs of different groups of the community, including those requiring affordable housing. So it's our position that this is really quite a important plank of national policy to meet that affordable housing need. And it's potentially for the plan, if there is a concern that the plan will not meet that need in full, well, are there strategic points that can be taken, such as additional allocations that could bolster the supply of housing and in turn affordable housing to ensure that those needs, and remember that these are pressing needs of households experiencing some hardship in their housing situation, but to ensure that those needs do get met.
Thank you very much, Mr. Robert. Mr. Burdett, your hand is up. Is that from before? Is that another point you wish to make?
Sorry, sir, no, my apologies.
Thank you. Mr. Banham, is there anything you wish to add to anything Mr. Roberts has said?
I suppose a minor point is that the councils have got a track record themselves in direct provision of affordable housing, which makes a valuable contribution.
Thank you. Can I look at? I'm moving around the questions here, but forgive me, but I hope you can follow. Question. I'll come back to question 5 later, but I'll deal with question 6, which is about student accommodation. Can I just seek some clarification on purpose-built student accommodation, and what is the justification for purpose-built student accommodation to provide affordable housing? And I understand from the hearing statement that the partnership would propose a main modification in respect of that provision being made in the form of a commuted sum. I think perhaps if you could just explain the rationale for inclusion of requiring affordable housing from student accommodation, and then explain what the partnership's position is now as to any changes that need to be made in your view to that policy in that regard.
Certainly, sir. The details are obviously set out in the statement, but essentially the city council who this issue predominantly affects takes the position that purpose-built student accommodation, whilst being welcome, is coming forward on scarce brownfield sites, which would otherwise come forward for housing, and therefore a contribution towards affordable housing from those sites is needed in order to meet the wider community aims. The practicalities of providing affordable housing as part of purpose-built student accommodation is acknowledged, and we've, as you said, set out some main modifications to make that clearer, that we would accept that contribution as a commuted sum, and the City Council are also committed to bringing forward guidance should there be clarity needed on how to calculate that commuted sum.
And has the requirement for affordable housing to be provided by purpose-built student accommodation, albeit in the form of a commuted sum, has that been viability tested?
No, sir.
So on what basis then is it can you be confident that it's viable?
obviously we'd have to deal with this on a case-by-case basis, and the modifications that we've set out in the policy would facilitate that.
Could you just take me through that, Mr. Bannon, please? How that would be dealt with?
Yeah, it's probably a good point to introduce Miss Davidson, who's a planning officer who's more familiar with this issue than myself.
Thank you. Good morning, Miss Davidson.
Good morning. Hi. Well, I think Adam has set out that the justification for this approach is the evidence of the level of very high level of need for affordable housing in Norwich at 42% of the total housing need, and the risk to meeting that need through potential loss of housing land to PBSA without provision of affordable housing. And in terms of viability, yes, the proposal is that this may have an impact on viability of purpose-built student accommodation, but that would be dealt with at decision-making stage when proposals come in. So is there anything more specific that you wanted to pull out on that?
So just can you just take me through the wording that would include that viability clause, as it were?
The way the policy has been reworded in the proposed modification sort of separates out purpose-built student accommodation from other major residential proposals. So for the major residential proposals, it does talk about in clause B about brownfield sites demonstrating that particular circumstances justify the need for viability assessment decision-making stage. But the new bit of proposed text, I don't think actually, it just talks about being student accommodation will be required to pay a commute at some sufficient to provide equivalent off-site policy. It doesn't specifically, the way it's worded at the moment, I don't think specifically addresses viability, and I think it should, because I think that was always the intention of the policy.
I thought I was missing something.
Yes,
on,
I think
on the hearing statement. So I was going to ask you to take me to the right paragraph on the hearing statement in relation to what you now be putting forward as a modification. But what I can see the commute at some point, and I can see that set out in your hearing statement, but I can't see modification about the detail of that viability, viability issue.
I think you're right there, and I'm afraid I think we'll need to make a further change to that to clarify that. Yes.
Thank you, Ms. Davison. Mr. Hatfield.
Hi, I appreciate it's not my issue to lead on. I did have a couple of supplementary questions on this particular point, if now's an appropriate time to come in with them.
You are dealing with purpose-built student accommodation, aren't you?
Later on, so there is a degree of overlap, but I thought, seeing as we were touching on the affordable housing point now, it might just be what
please ask the question.
Come in. A couple of fairly detailed questions, really. I was just looking at the suggested amendment, a modification, I should say, to the policy that's been suggested by the partnership. And it uses the term requiring a equivalent off-site policy compliant affordable housing scheme that would otherwise be expected on the site if the site were developed for general needs housing. So as I understand that, how would that be calculated, I suppose, is the question. If the assessment is, if this site were developed for housing, it would deliver this amount of affordable housing. How do you determine what type of housing scheme may have come forward, given that student housing is often a higher density than general needs housing, for example? what's the basis for making that assumption and that calculation of what would have come forward if it was developed for housing, given you don't have a housing scheme before you?
The precise mechanism for coming up with the commuted sum hasn't yet been worked out, and the intention has been to develop a supplementary planning document to sit alongside the policy and to sort of provide the detail for implementation of the policy. It's worth noting that there are other examples of SPD and local plan policy, particularly Nottingham and Oxford, that have similar policy requirements for commuted sums for affordable housing for purpose-built student accommodation. So it's something we'll be developing with our housing officers and looking at these other approaches, but it isn't set out at the moment, I'm afraid.
Okay, and just one second question, which is, I know from the hearing statements that affordable housing contributions are currently being sought from purpose-built student accommodation in the Norwich area. What's the basis for seeking that? Sorry, there's a plane going overhead. If I just close my roof light, the noise should cut out. Apologies, it sounds like a helicopter, so there's probably a hoodlum on the loose. Yes, it's just that question with regards to on what basis are contributions currently being sought? Is it a local plan policy, for example, or something else?
Well, no, it's we've got an affordable housing supplementary planning document that was produced in 2019. We don't have a policy basis at the moment for seeking affordable housing on all proposals for purpose-built student accommodation in our existing plan, but the approach was in the supplementary planning document was in relation to sites currently allocated in the site allocations plan for housing-led development or housing-led mixed-use development. There's a reference, I'll just give you a reference in the Affordable Housing SPD paragraph 22.20 to about 2.25 approximately, where this is set out, but it's on the basis of sites either proposed for housing or housing-led mixed-use development which not been developed, and if they were to be developed for purpose-built student accommodation, that would result in the loss of the opportunity for provision of affordable housing, and it's the loss of that opportunity to meet identified need that would be taken into consideration in decision making for any such proposals. So the policy, the SPD, it recognises that we don't have a policy in our local plan, but it was seeking to justify affordable housing in that on purpose-built student accommodation in that way.
Okay, so the SPD just relates to existing housing allocations, whereas the proposed policy approach here would be more, be broader than that, more wide-ranging.
Yes, correct.
Okay, that's the only questions I had. I'll hand you back to Mr. Warden. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Davison. I understand the point that the purpose-built student accommodation, in terms of its requirement for affordable housing, will therefore be subject to a viability assessment on a case-by-case basis if that modification was accepted. But is there any view about the percentage that might relate to purpose-built student accommodation, or would it be that the expectation would be 33% or 28%, and then that would be subject to viability testing on the case-by-case basis?
Yes, it would be, as you said, 33% or 28% subject to viability assessment at the time of the application.
And to date, in terms of purpose-built student accommodation, have they been providing affordable housing?
No, I'm not aware that we have had any provided through yet. The purpose-built student accommodation note and the affordable housing SPD have been in existence since about 2019, and some of the proposals that are currently being developed out at the moment had consent prior to that, and so we haven't had any, as far as I'm aware, affordable housing delivered to date on PBSA.
Or no commuted sums being made.
Or I mean commuted sums.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. We'll come on, as Mr. Hatfield said, on issue 4, I think, on relation to purpose-built student accommodation, the other part of this policy. The two are related, of course. But are there any more comments that people have on purpose-built student accommodation with respect to the affordable housing element of it before we move on? Okay, thank you. Can I just go back to some elements then of the policy that we need to look at? The question 5 talks about the requirement for all housing development proposals to meet the nationally described space standard for internal space justified. I know that Mr. Brandt from HBF has raised some issues with this, and I invite Mr. Brandt to just come in and just briefly express your concerns or your comments.
Yes, it's really with regard to the evidence, as far as I see it, is that the council appeared to have looked at just 245 homes with regard to the space standard, and I think from the AMR over the same period, about 7,300 home completions for that period. So it's really whether that is a robust number to look at in terms of whether there's been an endemic issue of underdelivery, of homes being built below the national described space standards. I think our concern really relates to the fact that delivery of homes and the flexibility to deliver some homes below space standards is important in some circumstances. I think it's important to recognise that there are households there who may need a home that is below space standards but would meet their requirements in terms of the numbers of rooms. So really it's just about ensuring that there is real evidence there, sir, that this is an endemic problem, to offset the benefits of that flexibility with regard to not applying the space standards. So I think it's really a case of ensuring that as is required by national policy and guidance, that there is a robust evidence base to suggest that these are actually needed, that there is an endemic problem. Recognizing that actually there are some benefits in terms of having flexibility in terms of space standards, especially in terms of tighter sites, that you can still have very good quality homes delivered, but it just might be slightly below. They might be slightly below space standards in some circumstances. So really, it's just about ensuring that there is flexibility within that policy and that the policy is actually properly justified.
Thank you, Mr. Brandt. Is it Mr. Banham? Are you going to respond? Are you person who would respond to this? Thank you.
Certainly, sir.
And could you just explain to me whether there is any flexibility in that at all, or whether there is no, the policy doesn't provide any flexibility? Should there be some flexibility?
We didn't feel that there needed to be flexibility on this point when we were preparing our evidence. We undertook what we thought was a acceptable exercise in looking at recent completions, and we found that a substantial amount were being completed to the nationally described space standard. And furthermore, we have incorporated the space standard into our viability evidence and found that they can be achieved viably. I think our position would be that the space standard doesn't set a exceptionally high bar in terms of how properties are built, and I think we would feel that there doesn't need to be discretion.
Thank you. Can I look at question 8, which deals with older persons accommodation, and just to understand the requirement here in terms of affordable housing in relation to that accommodation, including care homes. The hearing statement refers on paragraph 23, says viability test has not been completed for specialist older persons accommodation. However, this work has been is now being done, and the results will be ready at the end of January. Can I understand what the justification is for that, and also where that viability work is up to, please?
Certainly, so in relation to older people's housing, we undertook some further viability research to look at the McCarthy and Stone Churchill type of retirement living scheme. That evidence is now with you under the evidence base. I'm just looking for the reference to that. I think it might be B26.5. I'll just double check that for you. Yeah, it's B26.6.
Okay, thank you. I've got that. Thank you. So the justification for requiring affordable housing in relation to older persons housing at the same rates, 33%, 28%. What is the justification for that?
The principle for it, we believe, has been set by pieces and other local plans such as South Oxfordshire. Obviously, under the planning practice guidance, I think it's on viability, I think it's 007, that talks about the ability to have appraisal at the application stage for bespoke types of housing development. I believe it actually references older people's housing. So we would be working with applicants to understand the viability of their schemes and to negotiate affordable housing from that.
Is that a viability case by case basis in relation to older persons' homes? Is that covered in the policy? Is that what you're saying, Mr. Bannerman, that there would be viability testing at the application stage?
Yes, I think it comes back perhaps to the earlier point where we've, through preparing the policy, have tried to apply the approach of looking at plan making viability issues, but we recognise that the framework also allows certain schemes under certain circumstances to be assessed at the application stage. So again, we're trying to prepare a policy which is in conformity with the framework.
The policy is submitted. Does that make it clear that that will be at the planning application, that viability assessments can be considered at the application stage?
we believe it does, but if again, you know, if we don't want to be in conflict with the MPPF, so if some kind of modification was required, then obviously we would give that due consideration.
Because it says it's quite definitive. Specialist older people's housing will provide 33% affordable housing or 28% in the city centre. And it's not. Yeah. It's not one of the clauses set out above, as far as I read it.
Yeah, I accept your reading of the policy, sir. So that would be something that we would be willing to consider if that would provide clarity and avoid decision makers feeling there was sort of a conflict there with the MPPF, because that wasn't our intention.
Thank you, Mr. Brent, and then Mr. Hill.
Thanks, sir. It's just coming back to the evidence on the viability in B26.6. I think in the conclusions to that study, it outlines that there's a surplus of £840,000 in terms of that, but it makes no statement as to whether that would be a sufficient capacity to meet the requirements set out in the policy. If the viability evidence is suggesting that, I don't think that would be sufficient in terms of that, but in terms of delivery, it should reflect, the policy should reflect what the evidence is telling the council, especially if you look at, again, referring back to paragraph 58, which does allow a certain degree of negotiation, but it also states that a decision maker should be able to assume that a development is viable at the policy level, at the level of policy obligations that they're being set out in the local plan. So I think it's how does that sit with the requirement for 33% and 28% in relation to this type of development, and whether that is justified at that level, or whether the level should be lower or a commuted sum or however. And then there is exceptional circumstances. So rather than starting at this bar, it's actually starting at a bar that is reflective of the evidence that's been presented by the council, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Brent. Mr. Hill.
Thank you. We made it clear in our sort of hearing statement. We're concerned that it's a almost one-size-fits-all approach, and to take note of the reference to the Rectory Homes decision, where it does reference the need for, or the requirement for, certain dwellings that can be care to provide affordable housing. However, there are very different characteristics to some of the requirements for care, particularly, say, a nursing home as well as a care home. And I think this is actually highlighted by the additional viability work that the partnership have undertaken, which has been referred to a moment ago. Is it the supplementary appendix 3? Whereas I think when it talks about the additional viability work they've done at paragraph 17, it does say that what this notional apology does not cover are developments for extra care housing, sheltered housing, residential care, or nursing homes. And it then goes on to say at paragraph 19, it is possible that further subtypologies are required to assess and test small or larger notional older persons developments. So I think that makes it clear in our mind that further work is required to be able to say, to justify the provision of affordable housing for all C2 uses. And I think, just to add to a point that's been made, we've discussed in relation to question 4, that as it stands at the moment, the policy doesn't allow for viability assessments on greenfield sites. I think there's a high probability that a number of the care schemes that come forward may be on greenfield sites. And as we've just heard a moment ago, there is potentially the expectation that for care-related developments, the partnership will be entering with the discussions on viability at the policy stage. So there just seems a bit of a disjoint approach there. So, yeah, so thank you for that.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. Mr. Bannon, would you like to come back on Mr. Hill's point and Mr. Burns?
I don't think there's a huge amount to say other than that we do recognise that older people's housing is a wide spectrum, ranging from people who are effectively living independently to people with substantial care needs, and that this is a challenging area in which to define definitively what the viability considerations of such schemes would be, and therefore we are open to the concept of dealing with things at the application stage where there is justification for that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Banham. It is 5 to 11. We've nearly gone through this topic. I'm happy to carry on and conclude it, which will take us beyond 11. But I'm happy to also take a quick break if participants wish that. Mr. Banham, you got a view?
We're happy to continue.
Thank you. Okay. Can I go back to the questions then in relation to question 9, the requirement for 10% affordable housing to be for affordable home ownership. Is that justified? And is that clear here in the policy? Mr. Banham.
Our intention here is to be in conformity with the framework, and so we have sort of looked at the policy in relation to the framework, and again, you know, if it was felt that there was wording in the framework which implied something which, if there was wording in the policy that implied that it was in conflict with the framework, then we would give consideration to an amendment to correct that.
Okay, thank you. Are there any participants wish to come in on question 9? Mr. Brent.
From what Mr. Banham just said, I'm assuming he's referring to the inconsistency with paragraph 65 of the NPPF, which states that decisions should expect 10% of the total number of homes rather than the total number of affordable homes. And I think that's the inconsistency between what the council have set out in policy 5 and what is stated in the NPPF, sir.
Thank you. Is that correct, Mr. Banham?
That is correct. The only point I obviously want to stress is that further up the policy, we do talk about the justification for affordable housing mix being determined by each of the partnership's constituent authorities. And so, for example, our housing needs evidence shows that the requirement for affordable home ownership products is around 8%, and what we would want to achieve is that we recognise the framework but also the flexibility within the wording of the framework as well.
So thank you, Mr. Brandt. What then would be your wording in relation to that to make that sound?
Well, it would have to refer, sir, to 10% of affordable home ownership on major sites. I think there is a caveats later on in the in national policy stating that unless this would exceed the level of affordable housing required in an area or significantly prejudice the ability to meet needs. So I believe that there is caveats within national policy in relation to that can be implied. So I would suggest it just amended to reflect what's set out in national policy, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. In respect of the questions set out, I think we've actually been through all of the questions in a slightly different order and picked up some of the points. But are there any points that we've not picked up that anybody wants to make? And then I'll ask Mr. Banham if he's got any final comments to make. Mr. Roberts.
Yes, sir. Can you hear us? Can you see us?
We can.
Right, wonderful. I think we're back on the screen. Thank you, sir. So we had some points of detail under question 10. Mr. Roberts is going to come on to. Are we on to question 10, sir? Have I got that?
Yeah, I mean, I did pick it up earlier, but I'm happy to hear from you, Mr. Chung. I did move around a little bit, which may have been confusing. I'm so sorry, but I'm happy to.
Well, as I say, Mr. Roberts has got some detailed points under question 10, but just as a general point, we wonder whether the council could tell us whether they've applied their 33% target to the units which are going to come from the village cluster. So in working out the overall housing delivery of the planned period, have they assumed that the 1,200 units from the village clusters will deliver 33% affordable housing?
Mr. Banham?
Yes, we have.
Well, that sort of raises the question as to whether that is a safe assumption to be making, because we don't know what form these 1,200 units are going to take. So, for example, we don't know how many of them will be under the threshold for delivering affordable housing. So it's an unsafe assumption to simply take the 1,200, work out 33% of that, and say that will be the delivery of affordable housing from that 1,200 units. I don't know whether the council wants to respond to that. So.
Mr. Banham?
The village clusters work will be allocating sites of sufficient size that they would provide affordable housing.
Sorry, so I was muted there. That's certainly not our understanding of the way that the plan is written. So there's nothing that we can see in the plan which says that all of the housing that comes forward in the village clusters must be above the affordable housing threshold. I mean, if I've misread that, or if I've missed it somewhere, perhaps my attention could be drawn to it.
Mr. Banham?
I don't think there's a direct reference in this plan, but that is the work that's being undertaken as part of the village clusters plan.
Thank you, sir. We hear what's said. No doubt we'll come back to it at some point in terms of what we say the overall delivery will be of affordable housing. But Mr. Roberts had some detailed points to make under question 10, so I'm just going to, with your permission, to hand over to him.
Thank you. Mr. Roberts, you did take me to your tables within your statement, so I've got those and you've referred to those already. So I'm happy to hear if you wish to make a separate point.
Yeah, no, I won't subject you to that again, sir. But they are beastly tables. But picking up the village clusters point, I think it goes to the strategy in selecting sites in these smaller settlements. I think it's inevitable that the character of certain settlements will necessitate smaller sites that won't deliver affordable housing. And as it stands in front of us today, there's no clear direction on that. And it's a very real possibility that those 1,200 sites in South Norfolk and 482 in Broadland, there's a very real possibility that they're not going to deliver the 33% and actually could fall some way short. So that's a risk to the delivery of affordable housing later on in the plan period when those DPDs come forward.
Thank you. Mr. Banham, have you got anything you'd like to come back on in relation to the village clusters issue and its implications for this policy?
Not really, sir, other than to reiterate that the village clusters work would certainly be looking to allocate sites that can provide affordable housing. As part of the viability work, we did look at a smaller typology of 12 homes and the viability of providing affordable housing on that. So we're confident that the village clusters work will provide affordable housing.
So that just brings me on to my understanding, sir, was that this was your view was that all the questions are being covered. So this is an opportunity for anyone to say anything about any other questions that they want to say something about. So just under question 11, Mr. Baron's reference to viability. Just on the village clusters, we don't, without the work being done, because the village clusters, as I understand it, has been set to one side. It's going to come about under a further iteration of the plan, an SPD, or something of that nature. Without the work being done, it's simply not possible to know whether each one of those will be able to bring forward that level of affordable housing. Whether they will be above the threshold, and B, even if they are above the threshold, whether they will be viable. But generally, in terms of viability, sir, there's a broader point to be made, which is about the viability work which underpins the plan as a whole. So, for example, we see in Policy 5 that we're told that it's going to be 28% in Norwich city centre and 33% affordable housing on other sites. If we look at Plan 9, for example, we see that the East Norwich regeneration site falls outside of the city centre, so 33% affordable housing will be required there. And yet we've not seen any, we've not seen any robust viability work which considers sites within the city centre, east of Norwich, with the sort of challenges that they have, to demonstrate that they will actually be able to bring forward 33% affordable housing. So what's happened here is that the figure that's been put forward to you in terms of what the plan will deliver is simply applied the 33% to I presume that the number of houses which it said will come forward at, say, East Norwich. It's taken that figure of roughly 3,500, 4,000 and said you will get 33% affordable housing from that regeneration site. And yet there's no viability evidence that's been put forward to demonstrate that that's a site that will be capable viably of delivering 33% affordable housing. We just haven't seen any evidence to that effect at all.
Mr. Banham?
If I deal first with the village clusters, that plan has reached its Reg 19, Reg 18 that took place last summer, and it's about to move to Regulation 19. So the work that's undertaken has given us confidence in regard to the village clusters being able to make a contribution to affordable housing requirements. The second point, which I seem to be about the East Norwich Strategic Regeneration Area, I haven't got any particular points on that, but obviously that's a future matter, I believe, matter 7 or 8 that's coming up tomorrow.
But the expectation is that the 33% requirement would apply to the East Norwich regeneration area.
We haven't tested the viability of East Norwich as part of the work for the 11 typologies. That's a significant site, and it would have to be dealt with as a unique case.
But policy 5 would apply to East Norwich regeneration area.
Yes. Yeah.
So there would be a requirement for 33%, unless clause B kicked in.
Yes, that's correct.
Good.
So
Mr. Chung?
Sorry, so just to respond to that, I mean that's to do things the wrong way around. A policy has been put forward to you in this plan, and you've been asked to find it sound. And just focusing on affordable housing for the time being, because the general point about East Norwich and all the rest of it will come on to tomorrow. But just focusing on affordable housing, what you're being told is there's going to be 33% affordable housing on sites across the plan area, except in the city centre. Now, if that's the policy that's being put forward, and we're going to have an evidence-based approach to plan making, there must be an onus on the council, responsibility of the council, to put forward viability evidence to show that a site, which is we're told we're going to bring forward 3,500 to 4,000 units, can viably deliver 33% affordable housing. Clause B is all very well. Clause B is there to deal with situations where something untoward happens, something unusual happens, such that somebody can say, well, what we considered at the plan making stage is not what's relevant now. I mean, if you look at the PPG, it gives examples of the sort of circumstances in which it's justifiable to bring forward evidence at the decision-making stage. So, for example, the PPG tells us, paragraph 7, such circumstances could include, for example, where development is proposed on unallocated sites of a wholly different type to those used in the viability assessment, where further information and infrastructural site costs is required, where particular types of development are proposed which may significantly vary from standard models of development, etc., etc. But what's been done here is we're told that East Norwich, for example, is going to bring forward these 3,500, 4,000 homes. You're told you're going to get 33% affordable housing. That number is then worked through to the total number of affordable housing that's going to be delivered, and that's put against the need, and you're being told that the need will be met or thereabouts. That logic just doesn't. That logic just doesn't flow. Without the evidence, that logic just doesn't flow. Where is the evidence? And clause B is not designed, and what we're told in the PPG in terms of the ability to bring forward evidence at the decision-making stage is not there, so that you can come forward at the decision-making stage and say, well, actually, we don't want to provide 33% affordable housing, despite the fact that we're bringing forward the site for exactly the same thing that was anticipated at the plan-making stage when we said that 33% would be delivered. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chung. I'm going to hear from Mr. Riley, and then Mr. Holmbrook, and then I'm aware that Mr. Bird has got his hand up, but I'd probably like Mr. Bird then to come in and respond to all those points, if that's okay, Mr. Bird.
Am I okay to start then?
Thank you, Mr. Riley. Thank you, Mr. Riley.
Yeah, sure. I mean, just trying to. My name's Ian Riley from LandPro, and represent Glavenhill and various other PBSA developers actually who are interested in the city. Just trying to understand, there's affordable housing supply that clearly has that been related back to the contributions that you think you're going to receive from PBSA developments? I'm not sure if the two things have been married together. Adam?
We have discussed student accommodation.
I'm just trying to get my head around. I mean, obviously we're talking about viability as well previously, and the viability testing. And I'm not convinced that we understand what the viability testing would be for PBSA developments whenever there would be an alternative residential scheme required to be drawn up and considered to be suitable on that site. It doesn't seem to have been answered in the previous discussions.
But that's probably a matter for what the partnership has said, if I understand it correctly, is that they would be open to having that viability assessment provision allowed at the application stage. The detail of that would be subject to that stage. So I understand it, but I'll ask the council to come back to that. Ms. Holbrook.
Morning. Hi, I'm Sarah Hornbrook from Bidwells. I'm representing Hopkins Homes, Persimmon Homes and Taylor Wimpey. I just wanted really to clarify, we raised in our hearing statement concerns that the large strategic sites, so for example, GNLP 0132 at Sprowston, which my clients have an interest in, that they haven't been individually assessed. And in the instance of that site, that there's a requirement to provide strategic infrastructure. Will those issues be covered in the Part 2 hearing sessions that relate directly to those sites, or is now the time to talk about those issues?
I don't want to talk about specific sites. I'm in danger of going in to look at specific sites. We have the sessions in March that will look at the specific sites.
Mm-hmm. Okay, no, that's fine. It's just the point really, because the viability appraisal, again, which which underpins all of the discussions we've had about affordable housing, does say that it would look at those strategic sites separately, and it hasn't done. So I guess there is a point that kind of carries over to today's discussions, if that forms part of the evidence base for the affordable housing numbers, because we have concerns that the strategic sites aren't capable of delivering the 33%. So I just really wanted to flag that up, but we can discuss it in more detail.
Okay, I'll ask Mr. Banham to comment on that, but I'll ask Mr. Bird to come in now. Mr. Bird.
Thank you, sir. Just really wanted to respond to the points, some of the points made by Mr. Chung in relation to Policy 5 and Hornsby Homes. I mean, the main point, sir, is that Policy 5 is a plan area policy, and it shouldn't be, as it were, wound up with the East Norwich issue, which are going to be dealt with at Matter 8. I accept, of course, the extent to which East Norwich will contribute to meeting affordable housing need will be a matter to be taken into account in considering the overall soundness of the plan. But we're here concerned with Policy 5, which seeks to strike a balance between meeting need and viability considerations, so viably meeting need. And as far as meeting need is concerned, you've already heard about the extent of flexibility in the overall provision within the plan, which is one factor which is relevant to, as it were, the plan striking the appropriate balance as a whole. And it's not entirely clear to me what Hornsby Homes are saying Policy 5 should say, whether any of the points raised are actually an objection to Policy 5 or whether they're actually really an objection to East Norwich, which we'll come to tomorrow. I mean, if it's being suggested by Mr. Chung that the 33% figure should be much higher in order to account for the impact which he claims would result from East Norwich delivering, then he hasn't actually advanced a specific percentage.
Thank you, Mr. Bird. I'll invite Mr. Chung to. He's got his hand up, Mr. Chung.
So no, it's not so much a point about what Policy 5 should or should not say. My point is a very simple one. This is a session on affordable housing, as I understand it. So what you as the inspectors are interested in is what level of affordable housing will actually be delivered. You know, what is the need for affordable housing, and will this plan deliver the amount of affordable housing that is required? And if there's going to be a shortfall, what is the level of shortfall? Because that then all goes to the question of, well, if there's going to be a significant shortfall, what should the plan do about it? And it may, for example, be decided that more sites need to be allocated. So that's what this session, as I understand it, is all about. And my point is a very simple one, that at this session, the argument being presented by the council is that there's going to be a 33% affordable housing requirement on all sites. And I simply take East Norwich as an example. I mean, I could make the same point about Norwich City Centre and the 28%. So the council is saying you're going to get 33%, for example, from East Norwich, and then that's been factored in to the figures that I put before you as to what the overall delivery will be. And my point is a simple one, which is that there's simply no evidence to suggest that East Norwich can deliver 33% affordable housing, and clause B is not an answer to my point at all. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Bird?
Sir, as I think we've made perfectly plain throughout the examination, it's not an expectation that every site will be able to deliver 33% affordable housing. There will be some that can't. Equally, there'll be some schemes which come forward with 100% affordable housing being proposed. And you have to have regard to the plan as a whole and the overall level of provision being made for housing, which provides sufficient flexibility to give confidence that the overall affordable housing targets will be met.
Thank you. Mr. Banham, are you just able, is there anything you'd like to say in response to the point that Ms. Hornbrook made about the strategic sites and their the relationship to the viability appraisal?
Yes, I mean, the partnership and the promoters of the Sproston scheme continue to be in dialogue. We are in the process of discussing a statement of common ground, which we will endeavour to bring before you. Ultimately, we made the judgment in the summer of last year to engage with the promoters of this strategic site to understand the challenges that they were facing in regards to viability. And as I said, we will endeavour to bring before you a statement of common ground which brings those challenges into focus.
When will that statement of common ground be with us?
I anticipate, well, we're due to have further discussions in the next week or so, and my aim would be to bring that forward as soon as possible. I don't want to obviously make commitments on the part of the other side, so I'm not in a position to make a firm commitment, I'm afraid.
But in advance of the session?
That would certainly be our aim.
That'd be helpful. Okay, I'm going to conclude here with affordable housing now, but I'm just going to give the partnership, and Mr. Bird's got his hand up, any particular comments they wish to make finally on this particular issue. If they do, if they don't, that's fine. Okay.
We've
I don't think we've got any further
to add.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. So we will break now, and it is 11:23. We've got issue 2 to deal with. We've got a smaller number of people who are here for issue 2, and it will be a shorter topic as well. Ms. Feeney.
Thank you, Inspector. I was just going to check you felt you would be able to finish issue 2 in the session we have left before lunch.
Yes.
And that I could then let the issue 3 participants know to join after lunch.
Yes. Absolutely. We will conclude that before lunch. Yes.
Thank you. And it's just for you to let participants know the break then.
Yes.
So, thank you.
So what it is, if we resume at 10 to 12. Is that acceptable? Okay, so we'll break now and we'll resume issue 2 at 10 to 12. Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. We're going to move on to issue 2, which is concerned about older and specialist housing, accessible housing. I'm just going to deal with this a slightly different way, because I've got the hearing statements from the partnership, and there is a modification that's been posted, which we'll come on to discuss. But I'm going to invite the HBF and Pigeon, who I hope are with us, to just explain to me why they consider this policy to be unsound. Mr. Barant first, if he's here.
They are both in the meeting, Inspector.
I am here, so I was in terms of issue 2.
Issue 2, you were talking about the policy should introduce an annualised figure for accommodation needs for older persons.
Oh yes, sir.
Yes.
Sorry, I was away there. I was a bit lost. In terms of looking at it really with regard to older people's accommodation, it's really trying to ensure that the policy is deliverable in terms of the number of homes coming forward. So whilst we accept that the most effective way of delivering and meeting needs is through allocations of those sites, I think it's also important to ensure that the policy itself, or we would suggest the policy itself, includes a figure against which the number of homes, the level of delivery that's required. And I think it's important to have that level of delivery set out in the policy or in the plan, in terms of monitoring, and then how the decision maker can react should those needs not be met. And I think it's important to come back, much as you would do with overall housing, in terms of the 5-year land supply, and examine that, whether there is a need for that policy to contain that in order to be effective. So to be an effective policy and ensure needs are met across the plan period, that there is a mechanism by which, should those needs not, should there be an undersupply of homes, that decision makers can, there is almost a presumption in favour of that type of development coming forward over the plan period. So it's really just a case of being able to monitor against the effectiveness of that plan in terms of delivery, and then if it's not meeting need, and those needs that there is an undersupply, that there is then a presumption within the policy to support that. It's a way of just really making it an effective policy, sir, in terms of delivery.
And is that an approach that's been taken elsewhere, Mr. Brunt?
I know it's an approach that has been taken forward in London boroughs in terms of setting out where there is an undersupply, that there is a presumption in favour of development. It's been taken forward by the local authority themselves. The National Planning Policy Framework and guidance doesn't say you have to have a figure within there, but we're suggesting that it would be a more effective approach to delivery if those needs aren't to be allocated in full, then we would suggest that there is a need in order to be effective to deliver that. Okay,
I'll ask Mr. Barron to come back in a moment, but I'd quite like to just then ask Mr. Snowling to come in. And Mr. Snowling, you've in your statement you say this policy is unsound, and you think it should be altered. Please, can you explain your position and what changes you'd like to make to the policy?
Good morning. Rob Snowling from Pigeon Investment Management, representing Pigeon and landowners within the Greater Norwich area. I would start by just echoing the points that Mr. Berrant has made in terms of being able to monitor the delivery of specialist and older persons accommodation. But I think the point that I wanted to add to what Mr. Berrant has already said is in respect of, as we see it, some confusion around the requirement for older persons and specialist accommodation versus what the plan is currently providing for. So we don't see that the plan as currently drafted clearly identifies what the requirement is, but then it doesn't clearly identify how that requirement is going to be met. So if I could refer to paragraph 276 within the plan, which refers to a requirement for
Thank you.
Which refers to a requirement for 3,857 specialist retirement units over the period 2020 to 2038. There are other numbers referenced in paragraph 276, but that's the one that we have referred to in our matter statement. But it's unclear how that figure then relates to the different types of specialist accommodation that are required across the Greater Norwich area. So it's unclear whether those include residential institutions, for example. It seems to be clear that they don't only relate to extra care housing, as we have a separate figure that's referred to in the local housing needs assessment, which refers to 960 extra care homes. But there seems to be some confusion around what the requirement is, and then moving forward into the allocations within the plan. It's unclear how those allocations will meet that identified need. And I'm looking here on my other screens there at table A within the appendix to the policy 5 topic paper, which is document D 3.7.
Thank you, Mr. Snowden. I've got that.
Yeah, we saw so table A on page 3 of appendix A of the topic paper, which refers to the various sites that will deliver specialist housing. The table refers to extra care housing and refers to it appears to be specifically intended to demonstrate the level of extra care housing that will be provided for. But then there are a number of figures referred to in each of the allocations detailed within the table, and it's unclear again what the breakdown is of those in terms of residential institutions and extra care and other forms of specialist accommodation. And the final point from me is that the second from bottom row within the table refers to a site in Diss, GNLP 1045, as being a potential source of specialist accommodation. That site isn't a proposed allocation within the plan. Allocations for Diss are deferred to the Diss neighbour plan. This is a site that Pigeon are promoting, so it is a Pigeon site. And further on in the topic paper, this is paragraph 18 on page 4. There is reference to sites that are considered unreasonable for allocation, and then it goes on to detail GNLP 1045 as being an unreasonable site. So again, there seems to be some confusion in terms of the inclusion of Diss as a potential source of specialist accommodation. Yet that site isn't proposed to be an allocation. Site allocations within Diss are a matter for the Diss neighbourhood plan.
Thank you. We're not looking at sites, and we're not looking at admission sites. What change needs to be made to policy 5 to make it sound, Mr. Snowden?
So we think that policy 5 should clearly set out what the requirement is for specialist accommodation within the Greater Norwich area. And we don't think it currently does that.
Thank you. Mr. Bannon, would you be able to Snowden's points, please?
There was a glitch. I didn't quite catch the question, sir. Apologies.
For me?
Yes.
To you.
Yeah.
Would you just be able to respond to the points made by Pigeon and HBF?
Certainly. Yeah, our approach to policy 5 is to seek to encourage older persons accommodation of various types, ranging from independent living models through to sort of nursing type provision. So we developed a policy which was trying to seek to encourage those kinds of schemes. We gave particular emphasis to extra care housing because that's a priority area for Norfolk County Council, and as Mr. Snowling outlined, we then went through an exercise to look at the sites that were promoted to us and where we felt that they were appropriate to allocate for sustainability grounds. We then allocated them. That was a process that was similar in methodology to how we would treat a general development site, but we wanted to give particular emphasis to this type of accommodation because we realise how important it is under the NPPF. And then in our hearing statement, we've outlined how, with the allocations that we've made in the city centre, Colney, Taverham, and Aylsham and Harleston, we believe we can bring forward a decent level of supply, calculated at 8.6 years against the County Council's Living Well strategy.
So what would you say to Mr. Burant's point about that there should be a figure within the policy against which provision can then be monitored?
I think the principle of the idea is good, but obviously this is an area where new evidence comes to light quite frequently, and we would have to be very judicious in what measure we chose.
Thank you. And in relation to our question 2, you're now proposing a modification which deals with our concerns about some of the wording supported, etc. So you're proposing that policy that the word supported is removed and particularly encouraged is removed, which we're concerned about, and you've now put forward a different form of wording which would make the policy more positively prepared.
That's right. The thinking behind our approach is that older persons housing doesn't necessarily come forward with proposals at the plan making stage. they often can come forward on brownfield sites. There's a mixed private and public sector market at work here. We're conscious of the efforts being put in by the county council to bring forward older people's accommodation, particularly extra care housing. So we felt it was appropriate to make the link between the efforts being made by the county council sort of adult social services and this plan.
Thank you. In relation to question 3, the justification question was about is it justified that at least 20% of homes on major development sites should conform to building regulations M421. Can I just bring in Mr. Snowling, please, on this point, because Mr. Snowling, you say this is unjustified because there's not been any assessment of the need or otherwise of the for the application of this standard within the plan area as a whole or within individual settlements. Could you just briefly, please, explain to me why you say that and what needs to be changed to the policy to address your concerns of soundness?
Thank you, sir. Yes, our concern surrounding the policy is that the requirement for 20% of the homes to comply with Part M42 has not been justified by the evidence. We don't propose an alternative figure in our representations, but we haven't seen anything within the evidence base that the partnership have put forward that justifies that figure. And I think this is related to the other point that we've raised in respect of specialist housing and older persons housing needs. In that we don't see how that there seems to be a mixing of the two issues in terms of the requirement to meet specialist and older persons accommodation needs, with the presumption that requiring homes to be built to Part M42 will meet those needs. We accept that those homes will be more accessible. They will comply with Part M42, and they will offer an opportunity for somebody who lives in one of those homes to adapt their home to meet accessibility requirements. But it doesn't automatically follow that by providing 20% of new homes on larger sites to M42 will meet the needs that have been identified within the plan, or as we feel haven't clearly been identified within the plan.
Thank you, Mr. Snowling. And you have now had the benefit of seeing the council's response, the partnership's response to our question. And does your view change at all, having seen the partnership's response?
No, sir. Having read the partnership's response, we maintain the view that the 20% isn't justified.
Thank you, Mr. Bannerman. Would you like to respond to that point?
Obviously, in our statement, we made reference to recently published study that was commissioned by the Norfolk authorities and was done by 3 Dragons and Opinion Research Services. And as we set out, the requirement from that would suggest that there is a need for homes to be built to that M42 requirement. It equals 28% across the Greater Norwich area, and our requirement is set at 20%.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barnum. I don't have any more questions on this issue. So I'd like to thank people for their contributions. Thank you. Right. It's now 12:10, and Miss Feeney wants to come in because we just want to talk about some programming issues for the remaining issues that we've got. Miss Feeney.
Sorry, Nicole Wright had her hand up, Inspector. Sorry.
I'm sorry. I've jumped ahead. I thought you were coming. Sorry, Nat. I can't. Okay, I'm sorry, Nicole Wright. I'm so sorry. Missed you.
That's okay, sir. Thank you. So on the final question you raised in relation to M42, it is again. Sorry, I have said before, but of course, from Planning Places, Nicole Wright, representing on this matter the trustees of the First Viscount Mackintosh of Halifax and the trustees of the CM Watt Residual Trust. With regards to the final question you raised with regards to M42, we are in fact delivering a number of sites across the partnership's jurisdiction, which proposes at least 50% of M42 compliant dwellings, and we do think that that need is justified on that point. However, I do have a couple of questions to put to the partnership in relation to the latest paper, the hearing statement, matter 6 response to your questions. On paragraph 31, in relation to D3.7, we've heard about the proposed allocations at Taverham, Aylsham, Harleston, and Colney, where the partnership proposes to allocate extra care housing, and here it professes that this is amounting to about 8.6 years against the Norfolk County Council's Living Well strategy. However, in the latest January publication by the partnership, which is D3.7, the partnership identifies that there is actually a need of 4,207. So on describing the need for extra care housing, the partnership states that that need is 2,385. And in addition to that, it states that there's a need for sheltered housing of 1,822. And together those amount to 4,207, which is different to the need identified earlier in the plan. And of course, when you look at such a high need, it does 100% justify the need for a requirement to be specified in the policy for it to be effective. But added to that, the sites that the partnership have stated in paragraph 31 in their response to you, sir, as sites allocated for extra care housing, if you have done a comparative table of what the allocations plan that the council has submitted to the Secretary of State, identifies the same sites in Appendix A of D3.7 as sites that are allocated for general needs housing. However, in their response to your questions and publishing in just over a week ago, Appendix A, those sites are proposed to now be sites allocated to provide extra care houses. Now, those sites have not been consulted on at any stage of the plan for that use. Neither have they been assessed under the SASEA requirements. And so there is no justification for these sites. And the answer to your question 1, as to whether or not the plan has identified sufficient sites in light of paragraph 62 of the NPPF, is certainly not, because having discussed the typologies of the need across the what is D33.7, the other recent publication by the council in relation to older people's accommodation and the need for it, and assessing the viability of that need. That paper identifies a need not just for extra care housing, but for other retirement and other housing to meet that broad need of older people. And in response to the question raised earlier, where the partnership responded that the county council's provision of extra care houses is more or less what has led to the assessment of the suitability of retrospectively of those sites to be adequate. I would say that if we do not put a requirement within the relevant policy that needs to be assessed against and monitored against delivery, it's impossible to ensure that sites that are market-led sites that address the need for all the people who do not require rented accommodation or some element of social care within that accommodation will be missed. And so the plan is definitely going to be ineffective without that requirement being looked at in more detail. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. So Ms. Wright, you support Mr. Grant and Mr. Snowling's point that there should be a figure in the policy.
Most certainly, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Banham, is there anything that you wish to come back on in respect of what Ms. Wright has said?
I think just to say that in some parts of Greater Norwich there is a surplus of what could be sort of considered retirement sheltered housing, but we do acknowledge the need, and that was why we drafted the policy as it is. Where we felt we could allocate, we did, and the policy then, we believe, gives a clear steer that would encourage providers of retirement living schemes to come forward in sustainable locations.
Thank you. Just picking up just the thought on monitoring and how we will come to look at monitoring, but is an approach to monitoring that would relate the number of schemes that come forward to the figures that you've identified in evidence? Is that a monitoring issue that will be undertaken?
I can recollect. I think we've got 49 monitoring indicators. I can't recall off the top of my head whether there is one specifically for older people's accommodation.
No, there isn't. Okay. That might be something we return to when we look at monitoring. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Banham. Ms. Feeney, would you like to come back in for the point I thought you were going to make before I fail to see Ms. Wright's hand up?
Inspector, obviously we've come to the end of issue 2. The participant from outside of the GNLP partnership is in the meeting and is happy to proceed with issue 3 if Mr. Hatfield would like to. I know Mr. Hatfield is dealing with issue 3. It's with yourself, sir.
Thank you.
My view is we could probably, given the time left between now and 1 o'clock, I think we've got a good chance of being able to wrap issue 3 up in that time. So I think if everyone's happy to proceed on that basis, that would be my feeling, really.
Is the partnership happy to proceed onto matter 3? We realise that we will not be having an in-depth discussion on this, but we do need to establish where we are.
Yes, we're happy to proceed.
Okay, and would you like a break before we proceed, or would you be happy to just carry on now?
Happy to continue now.
Okay, is Mr. Carruthers in the meeting? Sweeney.
Yes, Mr. Crothers is in the meeting. If you'd like to put on your camera, Mr. Crothers, and your content will go into issue 3. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll hand over to Mr. Hatfield. And thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll move on to issue 3 then, which is gypsies and travellers, travelling show people, and residential caravans. Just to start off, I think it's fair to say that many of the questions we posed in the MIQs published just before Christmas have probably now been overtaken by events to a certain extent. In this regard, we responded to the partnership on the 19th of January regarding the potential identification of additional allocations for gypsy and traveller sites and advised on a potential way forward. Firstly, does the partnership have any further update to provide on the identification of potential site allocations as referred to in its hearing statement?
Yeah, in terms of sites that can be brought forward as potential modifications and then incorporated into the plan, we are continue to progress that work at speed. We're confident that we will have a sufficient number and quantity of sites that we can bring forward a consultation on, and that would be able to meet our coming needs at least over the next 5-year window.
Okay, and do you have any timescales at present for that consultation process to take place?
At the moment, we're I think the most likely timescale is sometime during the summer. We're conscious of the purdah period around elections.
Okay, so when you say over the summer, when are the elections in May, are they?
Yes, that's correct.
So you wouldn't wish to commence the consultation until after that point, presumably?
That's correct. We've still got some work to do in preparing and assessing the sites for consultation. So it'd be unrealistic for us to bring a consultation forward before the elections.
And is it your intention to pursue that consultation in short order after the election period, so late May, early June, that sort of time frame?
I'm reluctant to make commitments I can't keep. We would certainly be looking to progress as quickly as we could.
Okay, that's helpful in terms of an update. And obviously we've mentioned that in our correspondence to you, responding to your initial letter about the process that we had envisaged that following in terms of consultation and reconvened hearings on any identified site allocations and the evidence supporting those allocations. Okay, I think that largely covers then questions 3, 4, and 6, which perhaps were directed at the plan as submitted with no site allocations. Those that I mentioned before are probably now largely overtaken by events. I don't have any further questions on point 5 either. Again, that's largely been addressed in the context of identifying allocations within the plan area. Separately, a full gypsy and traveller accommodation assessment was submitted on Monday, but subsequently withdrawn. As I understand it, that was in order to provide clarification on sites that are currently coming forward through the planning process. Is that the correct position?
That's correct. Our consultants, Triple R, were working hard to bring forward the new study and to reach out to the various families and communities. The work we believe to be complete, and then the partnership identified that there was still further information that we needed to provide to Triple R consultancy for them to be able to finish the work. So we will be providing that extra information to Triple R for them to complete their study, and we will endeavour to complete that work in a month.
So the next month from now is when you envisage that study being finalised?
Yes.
Okay. I see Mr. Carruthers had his hand raised. I just want to ask a couple more questions of the partnership, and I'll invite Mr. Carruthers to come in. Quick question then about the updated GCAA. When was that study originally commissioned, and what was the reason for commissioning it at this stage?
We've been working with RRR Consultancy since 2016, and their original work was published in 2017. So we thought, given the elapsing time, it was appropriate to bring that work up to date.
And when was the study commissioned then? Was it back end of last year, presumably?
We've been working with RRR since we re-established our working relationship with them in the summer of 2020. The challenges in bringing forward that work and engaging with travelling community has been somewhat hindered by the COVID restrictions. As I said, RRR were working very hard to bring that study to the examination today, but there was further information that the partnership needs to clarify and provide to them for them to finish their work, hence why the study was withdrawn.
Okay, and does that indicate then that it's the partnership's view that the 2007 GCAA is now outdated in that regard?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful clarification. Mr. Carruthers, did you wish to come in and make a point?
Yes, please. I've got one issue over the RRR study. In 2021, there was a hearing by the inspectorate, and it was accepted that the RRR 2020 and 2017 studies were not a gypsy traveller accommodation assessment, that there'd been no consultation with the client group. Now, part of the problem that sits there is a number of the client group are now facing enforcement notices that are going to come into play prior to any allocations being made to resolve their accommodation problems. Now, particularly in case of the Sutton travellers, the inspectorate first identified that the council needed to provide them with accommodation in 2003. And there's been an absolute failure by South Norfolk in particular to provide any accommodation. There are also issues with the Broadland side of it, because the inspectorate, when that went to appeal, accepted the RRR study, and the RRR study is now junked. Now, if they're using the same methodology this time, it's not going to be a gypsy traveller accommodation assessment at all, because it's not following any recognised methodology, and you can't actually verify or validate the results.
And you mentioned, Mr. Carruthers, that inspectorate found that it didn't constitute, I think your words were, it didn't constitute a proper GCAA. Was that presumably in an appeal situation where inspectorate?
Simon Hand, in an appeal. He found that they couldn't live there anymore, and I'm now faced with 8 families who, come June, the council, when they did the Denton site, which is where most of them come from, did a direct action in 2007, which was flawed, and they've now turned up in Sutton, and they've now got an enforcement notice against them again with nowhere to go. Now, they need to have an allocation somewhere. We put forward allocations for them, both at the Denton site and at the Sutton site, and also on the Long Stratton car park.
And at what stage did you promote those sites to the plan? And the reason for that question before you answer is, my understanding from the partnership statement, so far at least, is that there were no submissions to any call for sites exercise. That's the position as I understood it.
We put them forward to the village, up to the village settlements allocations.
Okay. So is that South Norfolk? Is that the separate South Norfolk plan that's currently progressing?
Yeah, we put them forward to that because we'd fallen out of the timescale to take them forward to you. So we took them into South Norfolk's. But South Norfolk are aware that there's this requirement to provide a site for this family.
Okay. And obviously, some of the site-specific instances and enforcement notices you refer to are not matters I can comment on, and those cases aren't specifically before me. The approach I was intending to suggest to the partnership with regards to this new update, like I say, was published on Monday and subsequently withdrawn to revise the issues that Mr. Banham has described. The obvious way it struck me to deal with that would be to consult on that updated study alongside the published list of sites, which Mr. Banham has indicated there's ongoing work at present to identify potential allocations. And
no, that makes considerable sense. But if I draw your attention to what's happened in Mid Suffolk, the RRR study there was also identified as being defective, and they've had to go through a 6-month period of reconsultation. They also have a great many problems over identification of who are nomadic gypsies and non-nomadic gypsies. Currently in Mid Suffolk, and also I don't think it's reached Norfolk yet, they've been seeking to evict the non-nomadic gypsies from their homes.
Okay. I think the problem I've got at present is the most recent study isn't before me because it was withdrawn. Obviously, it's the council's intention to submit that within a month. And if that's consulted upon alongside the proposed site allocations, which Mr. Bannon mentioned, which I mentioned in the hearing statement from the partnership, we can then have that can then be exposed to comments and to representations. It might be in your case that you wish to challenge the methodology, although I don't wish to second guess any approach you may wish to take. And we could then wrap that up and have hearing sessions following that consultation exercise to go through both the GCAA and the site.
That makes sense, but to do this properly, they've also got to revisit their standard method calculations, because the non-nomadic and the non-gypsy travellers that live in caravans should receive their allocations underneath the main allocation stream. There is also an issue of boat dwellers. I live in Beccles, and there's been a massive increase in the number of people living in boats. And there now appear to be 30 families living in boats on the Waveney. The boats are normally bought for £50. They're the hulls, and they then live in them because of lack of alternative accommodation.
In terms of nomadic versus non-nomadic, is that reference to those gypsies and travellers that meet the PPTS definition and those that don't? Is that the distinction you're seeking to draw?
That's the distinction, but it's when you apply the standard methodology based on 2011 census, there should be a much greater proportion of caravans made available for non-nomadic gypsies than for nomadic gypsies.
Okay.
It's because they've worked out. I don't think RRR have worked out the correct figures for the nomadic gypsies, but they're not required to work out the figures for the nomadic gypsies. So it's very easy to work out what it should be by taking the nomadic gypsies away from the standard method caravan dwellers.
Okay. I should say at this point that I am a gypsy and traveller specialist inspector as well as a local plans specialist, so I'm familiar with these issues, if that gives you comfort. I'm reluctant to be drawn into a detailed discussion at this stage, given that the full study, the 2022 study, isn't before me. And it will be before me if Mr. Banham's timescales are correct within a month. And obviously a full consultation on that study will bring out these issues to the fore. And if you hold those strong views, Mr. Carruthers, I'd invite you to make representations at that stage.
I will make the representations. I worked it out for them on the previous study, and it's a massive undercount.
Okay. Okay. I think given that the existing evidence is acknowledged by the partnership to be out of date, we've got new evidence pending. the only approach we can reasonably take is to defer the discussion till after that consultation has taken place. And it may be that the identification of sites prompts others to comment on the methodology as well. So I wouldn't want to have that discussion at this stage and potentially unfairly prejudice others who may wish to comment later. But those comments are understood, Mr. Carruthers. And like I say, if it gives you comfort, I'm an Egyptian travel specialist. It's another area of
you'll be used to what the issues are then.
I've dealt with several appeals, plenty of appeals on Egyptian traveller cases, yes. Mr. Warden, did you wish to come in?
Thank you, Mr. Hatfield. I'm just going to ask a question of the council or the partnership. It was in relation to the new assessment. And is it the intention that you would submit that to us once it's updated, which you say would be in a month's time? But then that would be subject to consultation along with the site's work. And I'm just wondering what its status would be. So it would be a pre-consultation draft, would it?
Yes, sir, it would be effectively that. We obviously want to get the information that's required into that study, so Triple R can complete their work as quickly as possible, and to get it to you, and then undertake the consultation on the study at the same time that we consult on the possible sites.
And if you do that process and you run the consultation on the study alongside the consultation on the sites that are proposed to meet the requirements set out in the study, and the study has to be amended in light of consultation, would that potentially mean that you'd have to do some further consultation on changed on some different sites, for example, or different number of sites?
I don't think I can rule that possibility out, nor can the possibility be ruled out that other sites might come forward as well.
And you can't do consultation on that study before you do the consultation on the sites because of PERDA?
I think realistically, by the time we've got the study ready for publication, we will be at a stage where we wouldn't be able to fit in a meaningful 6-week consultation before PERDA.
The last time that South Norfolk did a consultation, it led to a change in political control. And that's where the Denton and the Sutton traveller problem derives from.
Mr. Banham, if you so just thinking this through in terms of timescale, then if you did a 6-week consultation that started in June and you analysed the results of that consultation and then presented that information back to us for examination with the sites that you propose to be allocated in line with the assessment, then the hearing session that we would have to deal with that would be sometime after that. So that would be later in the summer, presumably.
Yes, I'm not in a position to give a definitive timetable, but yeah, the broad outline of what you say, I think, is correct.
And then any modifications that result from that would form part of the modifications that we may recommend for you to consult on.
That's certainly the partnership's intention, yes.
Yeah. And just a final question from me: is there any clarification that you need from us in relation to the letter that we have sent to you in response to your letter to us at this stage?
No, the letter was clear.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hatfield.
Thank you. Okay. I think from my perspective, we've largely covered what are questions 1 and 2 under this issue. which relates to the evidence base. And I think we've got a way forward for addressing the revised GTAA once it's published. Okay, and we can return to any outstanding matters in the dedicated hearing sessions to follow. That would just leave questions 7 and 8 against issue 3, which are more detailed in nature. And I think it might be helpful to go through the policy wording under, or the relevant section under policy 5, just to conclude that section of the discussion. Okay. A couple of comments from myself in the first instance, and we'll take questions 7 and 8 together, really. There was a discussion yesterday with regards to policy 2, and we discussed the issue of sustainable access there. And given that that's potentially an ambiguous term, given how the word sustainable is defined in the framework, it's an umbrella term for development which achieves social, economic, and environmental benefits in effect. And so sustainable access is imprecise. Related to that, it's often the case that Gypsy traveller sites are more likely to come forward in rural locations. And that's actually recognised when I had a look at the development management policies in both Broadland and South Norfolk. So with those 2 points in mind, does the partnership want to comment on those observations in relation to that first bullet point?
I recognise the point about the elastic nature of the word sustainable. Our intention, obviously, is to ensure that all people, all parts of the community have access to schools and facilities, and essentially our requirement there is trying to ensure that sites come forward in locations where there's the ability to reasonably walk or cycle or use public transport rather than rely on the private car.
Okay. I mean, just looking at some of the lower order plans, which wouldn't be superseded by this document, the South Norfolk Development Management Policies DPD says in policy DM 3.3, it has a locational criteria similar to this, really, but it's looser. It says the site should not be so isolated from settlements that the occupiers cannot gain convenient access to schools and facilities to meet their daily needs. And that struck me as being a recognition, which is set out elsewhere in the policy, that Gypsy and traveller sites are often in more rural locations, and therefore inevitably will have lesser access by walking and cycling to services and facilities. So what's the reason for that tension? Or was it intentional, or has a different approach been taken in the GNLP compared to, say, the approach that was taken a number of years ago in the South Norfolk Development Management DPD?
I don't believe that the two were directly compared to each other in that sense. I think what we're trying to achieve with the policy criteria as worded is simply avoid the location of sites in isolated rural locations, and as the discussion I think went yesterday, if there was a more precise wording which a decision maker would find more convenient to use, then I think we would happily look at a modification to clarify that. Okay.
I mean, I think the first bullet needs to be modified in any event to remove the term sustainable access, because I think that's ambiguous and lacks clarity. But the wider point, which goes beyond that, is the extent to which the accessibility standards or requirements you might apply to a bricks and mortars dwelling might differ from a Gypsy and traveller pitch, for example. I noted that difference had been recognised in the South Norfolk plan, but seemed to not be recognised in the GNLP. A very similar wording is used, for example, here to policy 2. So perhaps in revisiting that bullet point, it's something to reflect on if you it's one for you really. But,
yeah.
Given that these sites, like I said, I've dealt with a significant number of gypsy and traveller appeals. These sites typically do come forward in more rural locations. I have had gypsy and traveller pitches come forward in the urban area, but they're rare comparatively. And with that in mind, it's whether it's appropriate to apply the same accessibility criteria to a gypsy and traveller pitch that it would be a bricks and mortar dwelling. I mean, I'll leave it for you to reflect on if that first bullet point needs revisiting anyway, which I think it does. It's a point for you to consider in formulating that modification to that first bullet.
Thank you, sir. We will give that consideration.
Okay, thank you. The other bullet point I was going to ask you about is the third one, which says provide for ancillary uses and landscaping. I wasn't clear what that meant, particularly with regards to ancillary uses. It would be helpful if the partnership could explain the thinking behind that point. Thank you.
Obviously, some gypsy and traveller sites, as you'll know, require additional landscaping to ensure the site has adequate amenity. So that was the thinking there. I think for ancillary uses, we were essentially thinking about storage type arrangements, for example, that travelling show people would need.
Travelling show people will often need space to store their vehicles and their equipment. Maybe it's business uses, and so I wasn't quite sure precisely what that meant. And obviously, travelling show people are a reasonably small proportion of the pitches that would come forward. Perhaps for clarity, it should refer to travelling show people. Perhaps adequate space for travelling show people pitches for equipment. Words to that effect, and just to provide clarity, because ancillary uses is vague for me, and the uses and the requirements for pitches will vary from family to family outside of travelling show people. I mean, I'll leave those thoughts with you.
Yeah,
I do think that bullet needs modifying for clarity, really.
Understood, and thank you. We will give that consideration.
Okay. Are there any other comments from around the room about the detailed requirements as they apply to the under Policy 5? Mr. Carruthers, did you wish to comment?
Yes, very briefly. This issue's come up in a number of different councils, and I understand the Showman's Guild has adopted a standard that a showman's pitch needs to be half an acre. It follows Runnymede trying to go and cram a number of showman's pitches into a housing estate. I believe it would be wise to have a minimum size for a gypsy pitch of 625 metres squared. Again, following some councils trying to go and get a gypsy pitch onto 70 metres squared.
Okay. And is that approach you've seen elsewhere, Mr. Carruthers?
It's an approach which is beginning to come forward, because the Showman's Guild got very upset about the fact they were being required to go on sites that were too small while the council was identifying their accommodation needs were being met. And I'm also aware that the gypsy community is getting very cross about being forced onto pitch sizes that are too small to actually accommodate the caravans.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Carruthers.
Thank you.
I'll leave the council to reflect on those comments. I think that's probably all I wanted to cover under issue 3, and it's by virtue of the fact that so much will be deferred now until after the consultation. Are there any final comments before we move on, either from Mr. Carruthers or from the council or from anyone else? Mr. Carruthers, your hand's raised. Is that a legacy hand or a? Okay.
no further points from the partnership, sir.
Okay. In which case, that's issue 3 concluded in reasonably good time for lunch. I know we're scheduled to go on to 1. I don't think there's any merit in starting issue 4. I don't think we'd cover that in the residual 10 minutes. So is now the appropriate time to break for lunch, Annette? Is that?
Yes, please, Inspector, and if everyone was happy, if we could come back at 2 o'clock, just to make it cleaner for the live stream and participants.
Okay. In which case, then we'll adjourn the hearings. Thank you all for your contributions, and we'll return at 2 o'clock before moving on to issue 4. Thank you very much.